This is the place, and this is the time.
Let me ask you, how many of you have moved? Just about everybody. Anybody anticipating a move? A few more. Okay, if you remember your last move, you know that, or you see a change coming in the future, you know you have lots of decisions. What do I take? What do I give away? Do I sell it? Do I give it away? Do I really need this? Am I going to need new things? Those are our possession questions. And then what about the relationships? What about friends? Will my friends stay in touch with me? Will I make new friends? That begins to pull us into this new future. What about the grocery store where I'll shop? Or will I find new doctors that are like the ones that I had? Or maybe you want to change doctors. All of these changes give us lots to think about, lots to question. And sometimes we get a little overwhelmed by some of the details, and we get lost. We lose sight of the purpose for the move. This past weekend, I helped one of our former staff members move. This was not anticipated. There was an illness for a parent, and it became apparent that this person needed to move out and stay, and so very quickly decisions had to be made about possessions to keep, possessions to give away, and to get everything organized and stowed and either in the truck or given away or packed for further mailing. We're a mobile society. I could be wrong, but I don't think there's anyone here who's living in the house in which they were born. And I suspect there's probably no one here who's even living in the house that their parents had. We've moved, we've traded places. Most of us end up moving to a very specific spot. We know we're going someplace for a job, we're trading houses. We know where we're going, but it is still hard. So the first note I'd like you to make to yourself is, what was the hardest thing about your last move? Maybe it was the hardest possession to give up, or the hardest thing. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe it was a wonderful view. Just make a note to yourself. The hardest thing I had to do in my last move. Okay, you've got that in your mind, what was hard. Now we turn back to Abraham and Sarah, or in this part, he has not had a name change yet, Abram and Sarai. Abraham and Sarah will be more familiar to you. Abraham and Sarah have lived in Haran most of their life. We find that out in chapter 11 in Genesis. They have flocks. They have a family. Their nephew Lot lives with them. They've landed in a pretty good spot. There's no great need to leave. They don't need to find new grazing lands. Abraham hasn't suddenly gotten a new job. They're not having a big dispute with their neighbors. All seems to be pretty good for Abraham, Sarah, Lot, and the rest of the family there. But we hear in those very few words in the first four verses of Genesis that Abraham senses a call from God, and Abraham leaves. God offers promises of blessing to Abraham. God promises a new land, that there will become a great nation from Abraham. But there's really no urgent need on Abraham's part to leave. He simply responds to this voice, this call to go to a new place, to pack up his family and go off to a place he doesn't even know, a place of which he's not sure. And he's going to do this for these promises from God. Shortly after Paul and I were married, I made a move to Dallas. Now, in addition to trying to get all the plans for the wedding done, there was all the packing that needed to go for a move. It was not easy. I was giving up a job that I loved, people I'd known a long time, a comfortable neighborhood, and I was moving to the South. What's it going to be like for a northerner in the South? How's the drive going to be from Cleveland to Dallas? What's this all going to be like? But the greater good, being with the man I loved and whom I had married, starting a new life together, that promise of life moving forward overcame those fears, those willingness to stay settled and stay in the same place and move forward into a new adventure. Little did we know that the adventure would eventually bring us back to Cleveland, but that is part of what you do when you're stepping out in faith. You don't always know where you will be going. Those first 4 verses that we read from Genesis are critically important to the whole biblical story because the chapters that have gone before are sort of prehistory. It gets things started. God creates a world good, but he also creates the creatures with free will, and they do what people with free will can do. They make mistakes. God gets upset, is willing to consider wiping the world out with the flood. And now God decides to try a new thing. God connects to an individual, to Abraham, and promises that through Abraham, a whole new people will be created. They will be God's people. So with this focus on a specific family, with Abraham and Sarah willing to respond and move to this new place that God would show them, they begin a new future. They begin a new future with God and for God. For God will now call a people to come, but call people to come by faith. And the promise that God gives them, probably better stated by the psalmist in Psalm 121, is that God will not leave them. God will not slumber. God will not sleep. God will be on duty to watch over those who come in faith 24/7. Now, God's promise does not necessarily mean, or God's watching over us, does not mean nothing bad happens. Abraham very quickly learned that there were dangers in responding to this God. Just a few short verses after the ones we read, Abraham is confronted by the Pharaoh in Egypt who wants to take Sarah for his wife, and Abraham has to decide how much he trusts God in this very delicate situation. So saying yes to God opens oneself up to challenges, to possible changes in routine, in whole life. Nevertheless, we go in faith or we respond in faith because we trust God to be with us. We trust that if we are truly hearing a call, God will show us the way forward. Over the last few weeks, it's been my privilege on the phone or through emails to talk with several members of the congregation who are thinking about new responses to God's call. They have come to a point in their life where they want to use the gifts and talents God has given them for work in this congregation, for work in the world. And that's exciting. It's exciting to hear their possibilities, and it's exciting for what that means for this congregation. Last week, we began a prayer ministry, an opportunity for some who are willing to pray with others to share that gift. We offered you the opportunity to decorate crosses for your own devotion or to share with our shut-ins. We've made available to you this morning a new opportunity to work with Habitat to help those who need help with their housing, to help rebuild a neighborhood. We've created a study guide for you, and there are copies of those by the front desk if you need to deepen your study life. And we've offered you the opportunity through the One Great Hour of sharing coin banks to begin to think about how you use the resources at your disposal. Each of you will feel or sense God's call to you, God's nudge in a different way. And part of our challenge as a congregation is to make a variety of ways open to you so that you find a way where you hear God speaking to you, inviting you into a new future. We don't always know what those calls will be, but we do know that it will be a challenge. Those of you who've worked with Habitat or even done some handiwork know there are scrapes and bruises that come with working on building a house. Those of you who pray with others know that there are challenges that come as you enter into someone's life and take on or share with them the concerns that they bring. Some of you have responded to the call to become leaders in this congregation. And you know, as soon as you become involved with a group of people, we don't always see things the same way. We need God's grace with us to be patient, to listen to one another, to move forward into the future God has for us as individuals and as a congregation. We know that God chooses to work through us, through individuals and through communities of faith, and God gives us particular talents. So think for a moment about the things that you do well. One thing that you do well that might be a talent God has given you to share with others. So let me invite you to make a note to yourself. What talent do I have that God might use? As we look again at that story of Abraham and Sarah, we realize that when God called them out of Haran, they hadn't done anything special. God called, Abraham and Sarah responded in faith, but they hadn't made a particular sacrifice. They couldn't have been said to have kept the law. They operated on faith, and they accepted the grace God gave them to become God's people. They didn't have to be perfect. They didn't even have to be good. They simply had to be faithful. Paul picks that theme up as he's writing to the young church at Rome, reminding them that they don't have to be good. What they have to do is respond to God's love, to respond with faith, to step out and trust God for the future. This gets picked up again by Martin Luther during the Reformation when he was so upset that the church was trying to invite people to buy their way out of purgatory. No, says Martin Luther, it's not your works, it's not your money, it's not how good you are, it's not your position in life, it's your faith. It's your willingness to trust God to the future and to step out believing that God will be with you. Well, how do we know it's a call from God? There may be a variety of ways. You might get a word of encouragement from others in the congregation. You might just have a strong sense that this is from God through your reading of Scripture. But one of the sure ways you know that a call is from God is that it invites you to step out on behalf of others, to do something good, not something destructive. We hear too many stories in the news of people saying that they did some horrible act because it was God's will, and we know that that's not true, because God invites us to love others as God loved us. So if you are being asked to help someone or to help some community, that is a call from God, not the other way. God tells us through Scripture that Abraham was 75 when he was urged to leave Haran. We know from chapter 11 that he had already moved once with his father and his brothers and their flock, so he had some experience of stepping out into a new place. But now God was inviting him to move again. God wasn't concerned about his age or stage in life. He was simply asking if he was willing to step out in faith. So if there is something you have been considering, some call to serve others, perhaps through this church, through some organization that benefits the community, think about the gifts that God has already given you, things that you may be able to use to benefit others in a way that perhaps you have not done before. So what I'm inviting you to do for your last note to yourself is there something, some ministry, some opportunity that God has been inviting you to consider? Make a note to yourself. I'm considering ushering or serving on a committee or doing this in the community. Just a reminder to yourself. There is an old poem that goes something like this. God said, go, but I said, I'm not ready. God said, go, but I said, I'm afraid. God said, go, for I will be with you as near as your breath. And I said, but what if people hate me or hurt me and want to get rid of me? God said, I have been there. I know your concern, but go. And I looked at the cross and I said, here I am. Lent is our time to walk with God, to be open to the invitations that God sends you. Jesus in the garden prayed, not my will, but thy will, O God. And that is our prayer for this Lent. What is your will for me, O God? Where would you have me serve? Give me the faith to step forward, to say, I am with you, Lord. Send me, for I am your disciples. We ask for God's blessing on these ministries and invite God's Spirit to descend on us and on this whole congregation.
This is the time.
This is the time.
This is the place.
Hallelujah.
This is the time.